Hello, it's Brad Laurie or BlockchainBrad, and today I'm honoured to speak with Jelle Pol. He is the business lead for Dusk or Dusk Network. Jelle, thank you very much for being here to provide an update for the Dusk Network.
Absolute pleasure. Very happy to be here.
Likewise, mate. Now, for all those wondering, this is an entirely free interview. This is to provide you with key information from the source. The value of this is educational, informational, and designed to give you the best insights from someone who really knows his stuff, and that is Jelle. Now, you come from a business background. You've got a master's as well in business. Jelle, just really quickly, tell us a bit about where you come from and how you moved into Dusk.
Sure. So business background, but always been on the business side of IT typically. Fond of technology, have some affinity there, but stronger on the business side. Did my master's in kind of a hybrid of business and technology. Worked for a startup called Mendix for a while. Was acquired by Siemens last year. Spent a few years at Shell, the energy company, where I was one of the people that founded the Shell blockchain team at the time. Right. And then I did a brief stint in renewable energies, mostly offshore wind energy, before leaving Shell to start my own consultancy firm. It was during my consultancy days that I met Emanuele, my technical co-founder, and we then founded what is now Dusk Network. And that started.
Got it. So Emanuele and you both have entrepreneurial sort of backgrounds, consultancy backgrounds. But what was interesting when I was researching you both is you do have technical skills. You do have technical knowledge, especially Emanuele with his technical knowledge. He's also done a lot of stuff with GPS, with TomTom, and a lot of other things. Yes. But there's also a team behind you, a significant technically astute team. And if you want to know more, if you're listening, you can go in and have a look at the team. But I wanted to focus now on the specifics of what Dusk is today, because obviously projects change. Now, you state that you are technology for securities. You stated on record several times you're a privacy chain with built-in smart contracts. Now, what does that actually mean to have this privacy protocol?
So Dusk we've really built from the ground up, right? So we're building on the layer 0, layer 1 levels, and it means all kinds of things. So we're building, or we have built our own consensus mechanism, for example, our own zero knowledge libraries and various modules. We're building our own virtual machine to support the smart contracting layer. And there's all kinds of technical novelties that we're developing that on their own could already provide a reasonable narrative, right? But at some point, you need to consolidate. Which is when, in a nutshell, it boils down to a public permissionless blockchain that's very much privacy oriented, and the smart contracting layer is really where the securities use case comes in. So, Dusk as a blockchain is suitable for all kinds of privacy purposes, right? You can build your dApps on there, use it to replace username, password, logins, right? With zero knowledge. There's a whole kind of a suite of things that you can do with it as an infrastructure. Right. But we find that it's also very well suited for securities, and that's kind of our tactical focus on the adoption side. But as a tech layer, it is what people want to use it for.
Right, and it makes sense because obviously what prompted you was the privacy aspect itself, making sure you have those confidential, programmable smart contracts built in from the ground up, literally at a layer 0 level. That didn't happen. There wasn't a lot of that. There was a significant dearth. We saw other developments like layer 2 solutions built on Ethereum. So can you comment on that for a moment? Because that is arguably part of the competition out there, and maybe it's not as robust because it's built on Ethereum, which has less sophistication because it's not a layer 0 solution.
Few things in there. So definitely. So when we look at the layer 2s, kind of the platforms, if you will, they wanted to enter the security token market, right? And arguably because they are well versed in the primary market, so issuance or fundraising or trading or you name it, right? They're after a certain use case where they see their own strengths. And then the only game in town was arguably Ethereum for quite a long time. But Ethereum is quite general purpose, and it allows you to do a few things very well, and a few things you cannot do yet there. So you need to bolt on something yourself, right, on the platform level to enforce certain rules and restrictions on the platform level, effectively working around the quirks or limitations of Ethereum for this specific sector, right? And some of that was slightly alleviated with the ERC 1404 standards and kind of the later standards that allowed you to enforce some restrictions, but it's still lacking in terms of privacy, even on a consensus level from a regulatory point of view, settlement finality, you name it. These are all quite key aspects for the securities market that you potentially counterintuitively tackle on the layer 0 in order to be compliant down the line.
Right. Well, let's really pull it back. I mean, we could talk for hours probably on the distinctions between Ethereum's value add and yours, because you are very difficult. You are very distinct by design. But let's explore the standards itself, because this is one thing that really does set you apart. You've built your own standard. We talked about the term protocol, but what does it mean? Perhaps for those people who don't necessarily understand that value of building your own standard for smart contracts, for example, what have you done that sets you apart there?
Yeah, so basically the way you see it, right, you have your blockchain, your protocol. The protocol prescribes how certain things in the network operate and work together, right? So a consensus kind of prescribes how in our network we incentivize participants to reach agreement on what can be added, right, to a ledger. And this can include some of the cryptographic primitives that you use and the type of consensus that you use, whether it's proof of work or in our case, private proof of stake. Right. And that's really how the network runs. And what you can do on top of that through a virtual machine is add things like a smart contracting layer. And that's really where you can kind of get to the space where you're arguably deploying your first apps, for lack of a better term, right, on top of this base layer infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Now, what we've done there, and it's probably easiest to lean on the Ethereum example, is to explain a little bit how these standards come to be, right? So in your virtual machine, there's a certain feature set, if you will, right? So let's say there's 20 toggles, and you can, pick a 1 or a 0 for each of them. And if you just flip them all 20 in a certain order, then you end up with a certain configuration for your smart contract, right? Right. And some configurations will be quite shit, like all on or all off, right? You get the gist of it. Yep. And some of them will actually make a lot of sense for certain use cases. And with Ethereum, for example, we have the ERC standard, and there we see a few really popular ones, right? Like ERC 20 or ERC 721 for non-fungible tokens, or ERC 1404. These basically represent proposals for certain configurations that took off and became really popular, but they're all configurations of the same underlying system in a nutshell. And that's obviously what you wanted to redress, is that you recognize that the system itself, the underlying infrastructure, could be improved by building something new. Yeah. Is that fair to say? That really is what prompted you to start doing it? Exactly. So what we saw there is we can do a protocol and a smart contracting layer that's much better suited for this sector, taking into account privacy and fork resistance and a better type of economic incentives, you name it. And then on the smart contracting level, that leads to a different feature set, right? Like, for example, being able to embed KYC outcomes in zero knowledge or enforce trading restrictions, or basically giving a security issuer, right, the tools that they need in order to issue and manage and allow their security to be traded. And then what we're doing with XSC, which is our standard, is we are effectively advising, if you will, or creating or proposing the first configurations of our virtual machine that we see as desirable. So whereas, the VM allows you to build smart contracts, that's all the ERC stuff. And now rather than waiting for 1,500 proposals to get the 3 nice configurations, we've done a lot of research for the security token sector specifically. So we can say, okay, XSC1, for example, will work really, really well for equity bonds, that kind of stuff. And then down the line we might have XSC2, which is more yeah, more complex stuff, you name it.
Right, and I think you hit the nail on the head right there. So essentially with the standards and including your own system, you've optimized this for your use case. Everything's geared through your own VM to make sure that it's conditioned for the securities market. So let's really dig deep into securities for a moment. Now, you're focused on the digital securities area. STO is one of the sort of the acronyms we hear a lot about. But we also hear changes right now towards acceptance in the regulatory frame with other non-securitized assets. We call them digital assets more generally now. So are you expanding beyond the narrative of STOs for the inclusion of others, or is it still specifically STO?
And how do you define a digital asset? So you there, I suppose you mean fully blockchain native, right? So they don't mirror something in the real world, or?
Well, let's talk about, in the context of regulatory support, right to the SEC and the CFTC, there's still a little bit of there's an opaque sort of response to a lot of these terminologies because they're also endorsing utilities to an extent. So will you be more incorporating a greater suite of potential inclusions if they deem them as supported from a legal standpoint, if they're endorsed as a utility rather, but more so the fact that they can be they can operate, that they can be endorsed by the SEC?
Yeah, no, it's the protocol, the smart contracting layer, that doesn't restrict itself in that sense. So we're very open to, if there's legal and potentially adoption related traction to certain products, and the protocol doesn't have any issues in hosting a smart contract, right, for that desired use case. We're effectively working on securities or regulated markets, if you will, in the widest sense, where we're talking about, what are all the baseline parameters that we see in the financial industry or in regulated trading, right? Regulated markets, secondary markets, and primary markets, and what are the things that we need to embed there on the ground level, and then whether we're talking about participation in a piece of real estate or a tokenized version of an existing bond in the real world, or whether someone is doing their equity directly on chain, or you name it. That there's not a huge difference there for it's not like, oh yeah, no, we can do equity but not bonds. It's a slightly different proposition, but it doesn't pose a lot of challenges technically to include the wider suite. So yeah.
Okay. Well, what about transparency? Often we hear that word thrown around in the crypto sphere, but I'm talking more from the technological standpoint. The transparency is the asset when it comes to audits, when it comes to real value in the business world. Now, you wanted to be cryptographically transparent, and lead that way as a digital ledger system, but also embed privacy. So how do you have the best of both worlds and have this open system, open ledger, publicly available as an open source technology, but also gradually, but also maintain that perfect privacy that's necessary for securities?
Yeah, so here it really comes, so there's two aspects to it, right? So one is the technical side and one is kind of the regulatory side. Technically, all the cryptographic primitives or libraries that we've built, from hashing to to the bulletproofs to you name it, it's all open source, right? So people can see how these proofs are generated, that they're correct and valid, and that they incorporate certain verification outcomes or parameters that can all be kind of audited, if you will, right? So people can place their trust in what the system does. Now, on the other hand, you might have an issuer. So let's say I am a medium-sized enterprise and I create a smart contract because I want to tokenize my equity and issue some of that. Now, they have certain obligations in the real world, right? So they need to be able to see, I don't know, a shareholder registry, for example, or if someone turns out to be a criminal, then it's probably good, if a court mandates them, for example, that they can recall a position, for example, or freeze it, or you name it. And then issuers, only for their own smart contract, they get a few privileges, right, that they need in order to manage their asset. One of the things that they could include here is, for example, a view key for a regulator, which still doesn't disclose any personal information about people, right? But it can show some of the things that are relevant for audits, you name it. So the whole technological base layers, public, permissionless, and it has nobody to do with anything that that doesn't have any business with it. Then on the smart contract level, if you deploy a smart contract as the smart contract owner, you get a few extra permissions that are relevant for the real world securities issuance and management.
Right. Okay. Well, issuance itself, let's talk about that in the context of uptake, the likelihood of this to even work. Can you give us some examples with your knowledge? Obviously, it's been a while now since you've started building this. You've moved across to a prominent exchange. People have clearly paid attention to your value technologically. But where's the proof in the use case that this can actually lead to something that's truly adopted?
Yeah. So, business adoption is always a little bit trickier in this sector because you're always bound by all this paperwork to not talk about stuff until it's in due time, right? But we've seen quite some maturity also happening there. So initially, the STO was the big thing, right?
Right.
Small, medium enterprise fundraising, you name it. There will be some place for that still. It is arguably not where the liquidity dream will occur, because just because you tokenize a $1 million startup or a chain of bakery shops or you name it, doesn't mean that there's any reason for them to have a daily trading volume of 5 million.
Right. I see what the illusion is.
Exactly. You can stick them in an order book, but it doesn't make for a market.
Right.
So their benefits will be different. It'll probably be more around access. So meaning that they have easier access to funds and that some investors have access to propositions that they otherwise couldn't access, but it arguably not necessarily lead to a lot of liquidity. The automation comes with smart contracts will also be interesting, because a small medium-sized enterprise will not be able to deal with the burden of properly publicly trading, if you will, whereas perhaps a tokenized format with a lot of automation could be. Then when we start really looking at liquidity, we're really getting to the larger privately held companies, for example. Like we see the IPO is taking longer, and some companies might never IPO. They could consider a partial or a whole tranche of tokenization, for example, so that a wider investor audience can partake in these opportunities, maybe offering all kinds of opportunities for founders or employees that are otherwise stuck forever with shares or you name it. And there's a good case to be made for liquidity there. Then when we look at the market that's already public, I think there'll be a few very interesting things there. In the last half year, I've spent a lot of time researching commodities. I think things like gold, silver, copper are immensely interesting. I think they're relatively sexy products to tokenize. I think the crypto crowd will enjoy them because they're very easy to understand. I think there's a lot of hassle about literally every stable coin out there. There's always a bit of doubts and skepticism, and you name it. And if there's a market downturn and if you don't trust your local stable coin, then what better than tokenized participation in just a box of gold somewhere with a party you trust. At least that's all there. So yeah, that's I can see them as very interesting alternatives. Not all commodities will be relevant. Like I don't see the crypto crowd getting super excited for going long on grain or that kind of stuff. But precious metals and that kind of stuff, I think will do very, very well.
Well, I'm just going to jump in there because this has been a long answer. It's been a long answer, but what you're alluding to clearly is the prospects of more security inclusions, and to do that, it would make sense to start looking in the area of exchanges, and I mean non-crypto exchanges as well. We've seen the likes of other startups. You would know about it. Own Network, for example, recently announcing their stock exchange ventures. Are you moving in that direction as well? Because it would make sense to be more robust than you are right now.
Yeah, so our take has always been that the primary market is something that will commoditize quite quickly. So issuance will return at some point to legal studios or advisors or consultants, but it's not really where the big adoption will happen for the protocol, probably, because they'll be by nature very protocol agnostic, just whatever brings them business, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the secondary market, it's much more regulated. You can be a much more of a differentiating factor with a strong protocol. And ultimately, people that tokenize have the ambition to trade it at some point, right? Exit it onto a secondary market. So our stance has always been that we think we can be a very, very strong differentiator on the protocol side, so on the base level, and that we can play a very big role in a much more stringently regulated secondary market.
Right. Okay.
Primary, we can have some role in there, but we don't want to build the big USP there because I think it'll be saturated the quickest. So yes, we are active in the secondary market. Our intent will be made public relatively soon. So it's not fully out there yet. But
do hint,
yes.
brother, do hint. What is happening? What's in the pipeline? Because one of the things I remember you saying in other interviews is that you're more than just the privacy protocol. You're more than just providing this resource for the greater good through your foundation, but you desperately want to build something that's of utility and revenue generating for your own team. So what's coming? What are some of the products and services that you're going to build using this protocol?
Yeah, so the secondary market is going to be a big one, right? So we want to, the protocol is there to be open sourced and therefore the greater good that people can do with it whatever they want.
But I'm talking about you, Jelle, because something's coming for you. I can sense that you're building things and you're not telling us.
Correct. Well, it's sometimes tricky to tell, right? It's not just up to me anymore, but yeah. So, but it'll be in the secondary market. There's a few very interesting partnerships there that will not just showcase our high-level intent to do something there, right? But that will also showcase a clear kickstart in adoption and user base, but also some significant real-world partners that come from traditional finance. That should really, help us come crashing out of the gates from an asset point of view.
You're not telling us a lot. Let's talk about something that you can talk about. What about small business, SMEs? That vertical or that target market is one of the largest markets globally. Often it's overlooked, but essentially security markets can really open up and enable greater interaction in that space. Is it something that you're aware of? Is it something that you want to tap into as well, given that if you do so, you're going to be taking part in one of the biggest revolutions in history when it comes to changes in the way people can engage in securities?
Yes, so we're working with a few SMEs that we want to help guide them to their STO, right? The big thing there is that for SMEs, it cannot be a very costly undertaking because they're SMEs, right? It's not like they can invest 100K upfront for a 6-month process, you name it. It needs to be quick, it needs to be snappy, it needs to be relatively cheap because they might only be looking to raise 100K, right? So from that point of view, we're doing it because we want to explore it, we want to do it, we want to educate ourselves, we want to educate the sector, and we want to make it happen. It's definitely not something that's cost effective or anything per se, because we're just doing it now out of self-education purposes rather than it being any form of revenue, if you will. But it needs to be done. So we'll definitely continue to see some of that, but as it kind of always is with new technologies, that in the beginning, there's still a few things you need to figure out, and once it matures and becomes a really crisp, clean product, that's also where you start getting your economies of scale, right? So that's where it starts to become cheap and really easy for SMEs to pick up. So arguably, I think SMEs are one of the most interesting spaces. I think from a free market point of view, it'll take a while for them to really pick it up because this stuff is just a bit more expensive when it's still being explored. So we are working with a few that we're just doing for free because we think it needs to be done, and we'll probably continue to do so. So for them, it's very interesting again. And I do see a lot of kind of midterm potential for maturing the SME market. So what I said earlier is that small propositions might not have a big reason for liquidity because they're only a small size, right? But once you start getting some critical mass and you've tokenized a bunch of SMEs, for example, and you can then potentially start to create indexes, right, or little baskets of these things. And that's where I think it gets really interesting, because then you can create, I don't know, the healthcare SME index for Europe, or something like that, and you stick 100 biotech SMEs in there with a few percent of their equity tokenized, and you create one ticker and you list something like that. And now all of a sudden you're not just mucking around with every small business individually, but you're able to enter the biotech SME sphere as a whole, right? Which will bring liquidity to these companies. But also makes it a researchable product for investors, because otherwise it's probably just not worth the hassle of listing them all individually. And that's where I see very, very cool midterm potential, where you can say, yeah, I want to invest in all the SMEs in Amsterdam, for example, like a horizontal index, right? Where you say, I think the city is going to go places. Or you can invest into an SME vertical like biotech, for example, or you name it. You can create this matrix of super cool index products for all these SMEs and still bring some liquidity to them without having to list them all individually.
Okay, so
and there will be,
you're optimistic about the potentials of really tapping into untapped markets, for the future, because there's so much that hasn't yet been enabled, because most of it's precluded right now. You see Wall Street being completely successful, but how many businesses can't access that marketplace? The majority. So it's exciting what your protocol could do. Now, what about the interface itself? Say I'm a business, say I'm someone who's considering, utilizing your protocol, wanting to have a security built into my model. How easy is it? You're going to partner, I understand, with enablers, with people or with entities that can make this possible. Is that the plan, that you're going to partner with them, or are you going to build out a seamless interface of your own?
Yeah, so it'll be both. What we're currently building, so the testnet's running. And as we fine tune that, closer towards the mainnet, you'll see the documentation upgrading, the SDKs, the interface, the tutorials, you name it, right? And that's just to enable anyone tech savvy to deploy a smart contract on top of Dusk, right? And to set their own parameters, you name it. Because it's a securities proposition. What we also see is that a lot of these propositions will probably work also with some legal studio to sort out how to best translate their proposition onto a blockchain reality, right? To capture it in a smart contract. So it makes sense for us to also create partner channels there, because if we are then the go-to solution for a legal studio, that means that instead of tapping into every proposition individually, you suddenly get a source of recurring issuance or recurring adoption, because they might guide a proposition to market 6 times a year or something like that, right? So if they think that your blockchain is the go-to blockchain, then all of a sudden there's 30 STOs for the coming 5 years coming from them, right? Because they do the legal side. Whereas with some players, it might make sense to individually guide them through the process. We definitely make it all available, so it should be for anyone that can do it themselves. It's there, right? We don't gatekeep anything. If you can figure out the legal and you've got a semi-decent tech guy, it's yours to do with whatever you want.
And that's the beauty of having the protocol itself and being layer 0, is that you basically provide for the tool set. And again, your vision, from what I understand, is you want to relax from any semblance of control over time, so that you can be in it authentically a self-regulated model. You can really allow for this to flourish in a decentralized framework and setting, but also on top of that is really focus on what you guys can build as well, just as anyone else could on this protocol. Now, to do that, regulation.
our commercial ambitions. Obviously, we know a bit about Dusk because we're building it.
Right.
But if you look at it objectively, we're just one of the first users of it as well, right? It's
Right.
like what we plan to do is
Yes.
not related to yeah.
Yes, and obviously, Jelle, I'd love to know more about that. You're not giving away a lot with the commercial focus, but it is exciting to see that you're building this to build upon it, build on top of it. Makes a lot of sense, and to really capitalize. It's ironically, again, not only having that first market move into the space of protocols for security systems, but also, in a sense of decentralized models, but also to capitalize on being one of the first applications, one of those first commercial applications particularly. So I imagine that that's going to be exciting, whatever you do. But to do that, you also have to appease the powers that be to make sure that you are compliant and you are, once again, supporting the regulations of the state or of the region. Now, what do you do in this context when there's a real mix, a confluence of regulatory opinions on this? Europe, as you know, the GDPR is well in place, but then there are different mechanisms in the US, for example. How on earth do you manage all of this?
Yeah, so when you look at it, it's at these different parameters. Then there are a lot of differences across jurisdictions, but they are typically different configurations of the same set of spectrum, if you will.
Okay.
So privacy is relevant globally, but whereas Europe might say, this is the level we need, the US might be here. So it's important that for that on a smart contract level or for a certain proposition, that you have a little bit of flexibility on the spectrum. But we know that privacy is a key component everywhere, right? And it's the same for some of these other parameters. For example, we've seen almost all the regulators in the world taking some kind of opposition stance to proof of work, at least in the way it's used in Bitcoin, for example, because of its wastefulness. But this, by definition, means that we move into a more of a kind of BFD-inspired place that later led to kind of the proof of stake implementation.
Yes. Well, you also see DAGs emerge as well, which essentially is a type of blockchain anyway, and vice versa. But at the consensus layer, what you're really saying is that for the most part, regardless of what consensus has been employed, it's post proof of work that really matters because of the exhaustive nature of this.
But because these guys that are, at 10 in the morning, they're going to have a meeting to look at your protocol or your business license application, whatever, and at 2 in the afternoon, they're going to have a policy meeting about the environment.
Right.
Even you can make the case that technically it's all legal. They are wearing multiple hats, right? These policymakers are the same guys that advise regulatory bodies, you name it. And if you're going against that current, this completely separate from how you personally feel ideologically about the wastefulness, right? It's just not the road you should take. So post proof of work was a very clear indicator. I think like settlement finality was a really big one. So you cannot have a 6-block confirmation time when you're transferring securities, right? It brings all kinds of challenges. It needs to be real time according to the kind of regulatory definitions. And the same with forking. Like if you need to build in a certain fork resistance, because otherwise what happens if someone forks your chain? Like what are these 2 tokens now suddenly? They're definitely not 2 shares all of a sudden, right?
And no business was ever going to accept that.
No, exactly. So a lot of the stuff is going to be relevant everywhere, and then some of the stuff that is going to be conceptually relevant, but arguably in different configurations. So you add the flexibility there, and the other stuff is like hard requirements across the globe. Everyone wants fork resistance. Everyone wants post POW, right? And that's how you build it.
Right. Okay. So obviously, the fact that all the things we've mentioned, because you're building this from the ground up, you're in control of these new world-first smart contract designs because you've built in privacy. through all the technological, and if people would like to go and look more into them, they certainly can, because we don't have time in this interview to really explicate the depths of the technology, but it is there. Now, one thing I did want to talk to you about is the recent Blockstack move. We saw an announcement that they spent quite a lot of time and money to get that Reg A plus acceptance. They are a utility model though, so I wanted to expand the potentials as well and find out, can in fact, an ICO be brought back to the discussion? Can you really expand the potentials of even beyond the narrative of security to be more inclusive of something like Blockstack in the future, despite it being a utility token?
Yeah, so if ICOs mature to a stage where they want to enforce some of the regulation that stems from the traditional securities market, right? Not because they have to, but because we see that's where regulatory approval is leaning towards, or simply because they want to intrinsically mature according to certain beliefs. Then it's a great standard for that as well, right? I can imagine with a utility token, you might want to say, well, even though it's a utility, I still want to enforce certain trading restrictions on it to ensure that only allowed jurisdictions can trade it, or only people that have passed KYC can trade it, and it might over time, not converge per se, but ICOs might get closer to STO type restrictions, because they're there for a reason, right? Some of them might make sense and could be with a bit of disruption. Some of them are there for a very good reason. And if you can cherry pick some of those, then I could definitely foresee almost like a XSC 1 light version, right, for the new ICO type token standard, where you take the best of the traditional finance world and apply it to your ICO token. So,
so the potential is essentially there, for a greater sort of pool of potential, because right now we're seeing the discussions and a lot of the proof. And one of them is one that we'd mentioned before pre-interview, was Modem, for example. They've also found a way to convert from their utility model across to an equity-based one into a security. So is that something also on your mind, where you're alluding to this anyway, where if that can happen, do you see the potential for more of these current models of utility tokens to make the switch?
Yeah, no, and it's in two ways. So one is where they want to voluntarily move to a security token model,
right?
Because they see for certain reasons that's better. And the second piece will be where projects claiming to be a utility will get themselves classified as security, and then they have to move, whether that's trading venues or protocols or both. That's also going to be a very interesting one.
That is, and also what are the processes to make sure that they're not built on bullshit? Again, that behooves the regulatory powers that be to make sure that there's proper checks and balances done on that transition, should they choose that, to make sure they're legitimate securities.
Yeah, so the voluntary transition will probably be quite good, because it's a signal, and I think the regulators will agree with it. And at any time with the regulators, if you go there to open the dialogue, then it's usually fine. They understand that even though that they're, as you say, the powers that be, they will not necessarily be the powers that stop stuff forever, right? So they're open to the conversation. They just want to make sure that it happens properly.
Yep.
However, if you're in the wave that is force moved, because they classified you as something different than what you claim to be, and especially if you're on the forefront of that wave, when examples still need to be made, then you're in for a world of pain.
Yes, so, exactly. We're seeing that pain play out already right now, Jelle, as well. Now, you are part of a $1 trillion marketplace, essentially, being part of the digital asset sort of innovation in that sector. So with regard to the things like we hear the narratives of, we've talked about ICO, but we see IEO, we see IXO, we see all these kinds of acronyms. What's your take on the way things have played out recently, with the way that marketing is really dominating the space? The way that startups enter seems to be more important right now than what they're doing longitudinally.
Yeah, no, it's especially with with a little bit more of a bearish market over the last year, right? And there's still a lot of good ideas, but you know, there's so much skepticism and there's so much kind of saturation also in people from, you know, them being beaten to death with marketing over the last few years. And the sector's answer seems to be more marketing.
It does seem to be that.
Yeah.
So do you think that,
Yeah.
right, do you think that given that we're going to see a less is more approach? It seems like already, as you suggested, that there's a bit of a saturation effect now. Do you think that we're going to see fewer succeed in this scenario? Where, for example, yourselves, as someone who's trying to build a protocol from the ground up, are we going to see just a few emerge successfully, do you think, in the future before we start to see evidence empirically that this can work?
In our space, I think we stand a pretty good chance of less is more, because our adoption is not necessarily B2C driven, meaning that if we convince regulators and legal studios and large financial players that this is the way, and they agree and they adopt, and you know, we start moving into that real traction, then that is probably good enough, at least on the short term, right? Because it's so much external validity, so much uptake. It will be, you know, it's everything the protocol needs in this stage. Also, the securities market is more regulated, so propositions on top, by definition, will have some more limitations. How much marketing they can do, right? You're not really allowed to stand on the tallest roof and shout about how your equity is going to flip times 10, right? That's how you
much to the dismay of many of the speculative proponents of crypto, because they all want to see the next 10x, and that's going to be a challenge in itself. Is really to try and, you know, set forth a new narrative of stability or of less volatility than we see now. Now, to build all this, to really wrap this together in what you've built, you have your own utility token. Now that is potentially an irony, because here you are, an advocate as a protocol for security issuances, but generated and engineered and architected, and the fuel for this is a utility token. How on earth does that work? I mean, obviously, I just want to be really bold and ask that, because if you're a utility token from the outset, you know, how can you sort of advocate for the security model?
Well, the security model is a use case, right? I'm not against utility tokens, but I think where the work that's been done by Ethereum, right, with ERC20, etc., there was just way less value to be added there until certain specific problems arise, where there might be a dev ecosystem that, for example, really wants to focus on the privacy aspects of things, and there we might be able to capture a really good niche in the utility space as well. But the very immediate opportunities that we saw were very much around securities, because there was nothing there, nothing purpose-built, nothing that really encompassed as much of that stack of requirements as possible on the protocol level, right? It all had to be bolted on, or you know, also, as you said,
and that makes total sense. That makes total sense. But once again, the big distinction between you and Ethereum, aside from the protocol, is that you really clearly are proponents of securities. So what's the core function? Why do you need to have, you know, the core fuel for your ecosystem as a utility? Are we terminologically and lexically, are we using the right term when we say utility for what you actually do?
Yeah, so you use it. What we typically see in blockchain, right, is that like Ether on the Ethereum network, it serves gas and functionalities, right? And Dusk is very similar on the Dusk network. So it's used to pay for transactions, or to deploy smart contracts, or to maybe call certain specific functionalities in the smart contract to assist with a corporate action, or you name it. Right. And the reason for these things is, well, that obviously in order for a network to decentralize, we need to create certain incentive mechanisms, right? So that people behave the way you want them to, because there's no incentive like, I don't know, you're losing your job in a centralized system or something like that, right? So there needs to be incentivization so that nodes behave in a majority according to, you know, how the mechanisms are designed, so that you have a majority of good actors. That's why we need these incentives. And then on the other hand, it's a protection mechanism, right? So things that effectively protect yourselves against things like Citadel attack or DDoS, whatever you want to call it, right? It being very, very cheap to overload your network, these kind of things. You also need to build in certain thresholds to one, incentivize people to be good actors because you want to decentralize it, and two, to protect yourselves against, well, you know, the 51% attacks of the world, that kind of stuff. When you see that it becomes really, really cheap to do, someone's going to do it. So you need to have a certain baseline there that prevents incentivize the behavior that you do want to see and disincentivize bad behavior. That's ultimately when you really make it abstract. What these native utility coins are for.
Right, and the reason I ask is because often there's a bit of a conflation between utility and currency. And you know, having read through some of the literature on Dusk and even on your website, there's even allusions to that conflation. So do you think it's reasonable for some to appropriate your functionality or even form as a currency? Because if it's utilized for trade, or if it's utilized for even for staking, for example, is it fair to allude to that, or are there clear distinctions, do you think?
I personally always make a very clear distinction between the two. It's always tricky to see what people will end up using it for, right? If other people start to use your product in a certain way, or especially when it becomes open source, you don't know yourself what the killer app is, right? Or what people are going to use it for, or how they see optimal use for your system. We're very much focused on the technical necessities. The currency space is a tricky one. It's not one that I'm personally advocating.
And once again, we come down to that lexical conundrum again, because you see the questions of, as we mentioned, utility, and then across to commodity and concurrency. Then there's the big challenge of security in the sense of how it's deemed through the Howey test. So, as you mentioned before, a lot of people are here for speculation. They want to see this pseudo security environment where people can go and, you know, achieve a 10x quickly. For that to happen, everyone's expecting growth in value. So how do people, taking part in your ecosystem now, today, not imbue it that way, not color it as something that has the potential of value growth when it's designed to be something relatively, I would imagine, stable, given that it's meant to be that fuel?
So the question would be, how do people not view it as that?
I think so, because right now, and not just you, Jelle, but just more generally, the way in which the space is treated for tokens more generally is essentially like a pseudo security. They're treating it with an expectation of value built in. So you're clearly a utility. How do you really educate people to explain what that actually means when it comes to expectation of value?
Yeah, so it's always a little bit tricky, right? Because there's such a speculative aspect to the sector, like you say. So, you know, teams are never allowed to comment on price or where things are going, or how business adoption might lead to price movements. These are the things that you really, really need to avoid, and that you typically cannot comment on. The big thing also when looking at stuff like Howey is that it's once you achieve full decentralization, then it's also up to the network, right? So the tricky stretch is especially now, where arguably we still have some control over things, right? Because we're still developing it. Once everything is prescribed by community voting or some form of decentralized governance, you name it, then you already get into much easier to navigate waters, because there's no centralized promise of profit, or you name it, these type of things that that make it so difficult now to you want to talk about adoption and all the great things that we're doing with the network, but yet we can never comment on the other side of things.
Yeah, it's always a challenge. I appreciate that, because first and foremost, you want to lead out the utility, you want to lead out the protocol and let that flourish. So I'll leave that there. Now let's talk about the raise itself, because in November, December last year, you did raise some capital. Correct me if I'm wrong, but about 15 mil, no bonuses, 50% tokens, 12-month vesting, that sort of thing. But I really just wanted to ask you, given that, did you stay true to that? Did you make sure there were no special deals going on in the back end? Because we know that projects have done it in the past. Can we trust that that was all transparent, it was all clean? And do you have some money left? You know, that's what I want to find out. The runway.
Yeah, so one of the things that we did, for example, with the vesting is we've created a smart contract that takes care of our vesting. So you can see, for example, that all of our investors are on that contract, and they they get their tokens according to the schedules that we claim that they are subject to, right? And it's the same for the bonuses. So we've really tried to capture that in quite a transparent way.
That's
because
cool.
Otherwise, what's my worth, right?
The value of the blockchain there, you see? It's all there. It's all there.
Exactly. Let's at least use it for the stuff that it's already really great at, and then continue to build on it for the stuff that will be great at in the future.
Right.
But yeah, no, not a fan of bonuses. Also because what does it end up doing? Everybody wants to get into the new highest tranche or whatever, and
it's just a pump dump cycle of bullshit.
Yeah, so we took all of that out. Didn't need it. In the end, we raised roughly 8 million. So we had it's probably the max valuation that you saw. So we raised around 8 for.
Okay. Well, it was a tough market back then, so you've done well to raise 8. So congratulations on that. And then you have a multi-year. Well, you have a multi-year runway, I think, as well, from what you mentioned in previous interviews.
Exactly. That's typically just what we call it because. I'd love to fully open the books, and we have ambitions to do that at least annually. But like rolling budget transparency would probably be quite counterproductive for us right now, because then everybody's suddenly in your wallet, whereas we need to be building.
Right. Well, the main thing is you have the capacity. That's what I wanted to find out, that you can still pay your team, you can still grow, you can scale.
No, we're from the Dutch school of money management, right? So everything is squeezed extremely tight. We're all Scrooges.
I hear that from Germany also, so I'm not surprised. Europe seems to be very tight with their money. Now, speaking of money,
so we're good for a few years.
Well, speaking of money and liquidity, let's talk about the big B. Let's talk about Binance. July 22 was a big day for you. You managed to get that far. And again, not to FOMO, but you achieved a milestone because you hit something that has significant reputation, significant liquidity support. So what was it like? What does it mean for you to be on Binance? And do you have any visions of grandeur? Do you want to get to Coinbase?
Grandeur. I prefer ambition.
Okay, well, let's say ambition.
No, of course, being able to list on Binance was great. It's a great opportunity. It's one of the exchanges that people constantly strive to be on. We're on Bitfinex as well, and Bittrex, other great top exchanges that don't fake the volume and you name it, right? We're really happy with the trading venues that we came out of the gates with. I have a few left on my list. Some I want to achieve sooner than others. Coinbase is arguably very much a mainnet enterprise. They typically
you're moving towards mainnet, Jelle, so that sounds like a good plan.
Yeah, so at least don't expect it prior to our mainnet deployment, because that's not really up their alley. But obviously I'm aware of the big names, and I'll be the last to not give it a go, right? But I think so far we're getting relatively good at it.
Right, and obviously you had to pitch. The process would have been quite rigorous, I imagine, to get to even to Binance. Just from some of the discussions I've had and learned about the processes, that are inherent with trying to get there. That would be the same, no doubt, for the rigors involved with subsequent exchanges post mainnet. Are you confident that you've got the goods with regard to being that functional, viable, proven mainnet? Because it seems that more and more from now and in the future, it's all or nothing. It's real deal or die.
Yeah, I feel like we're kind of on the coattails of that movement, right? Because we raised, like in the depths of the bear, right? Potentially one of the last raises of its kind like that, right? That managed to
Get through.
succeed. And now we are probably, yeah, I feel like many of these doors are probably closing behind us almost, where now we have good listing adoption with on the testnet phase, right? Whereas and we're able to show these guys under NDA a lot more of the adoption of, or where some of the next tech that's to be open sourced is at. So obviously they get a little bit of a more in-depth look behind the curtains. But still, it might be in the future that a year from now it's mainnet or nothing, as you say.
So you're one of the lucky ones who managed to get inside the fence before it closed, the gate before the gate.
We sometimes, like in the race, it was really rough. It was extremely hard work. Like probably a year before that, it would have been a lot easier with a lot less. But it does leave you kind of battle tested, and we're seeing some of the merits of that now, because we've never been really handed it on a silver plate, and this is probably the reason why we're seeing arguably some small successes now. It's because we have to get good to survive, if you will.
Got it. Okay, so I want to talk to you a bit about some of the competitors out there. If you want to deem them those, you may not regard them as competitors. Algorand has been raised a few times in different contexts. I want to talk about Beam for the privacy values, even though they do something very different. Yeah. And even Own, as I mentioned. Do any of these ever concern you or your team? Or do you just simply, move on with the business of the day, and that's building your own protocol?
So we definitely discuss other propositions and we look at them, but rarely, if ever, does it lead to any concerns. We definitely just stick our head down and get to work. We think we have a lot of USPs or technical modes or compliance modes that and there's plenty of market to share. We have a very unique proposition, so we've never had a week where it's like, oh, let's focus on these guys specifically because we want to beat them or anything.
Got it. So is there room in this space to coexist?
Oh, for sure. So when I look at Own, for example, what I really, really like about them is that they are so impressive at lifecycle management.
Right.
Like these, they stem from Computer Share, really big company that did all these hugely complex corporate share programs. Like when I was still working for Shell, I had Shell shares in a Computer Share account, right? And these are these huge, decade-long lifecycle management processes. And this is where they really shine. It's very pretty dashboarding. They have this registry and all these bells and whistles, and I think it's awesome. It's
well, Sasha would be happy with you right now, shilling his project. So, but I think it's cool. It's cool that you see the value in each other, I think.
But it's complementary, right? Like at some point, there's going to be changes also on their side of the fence or on our side of the fence, and if they can teach us life cycle, and if we can help with some base layer tech or some you name it, right? Then let's build it together. There's no way that
you're not alone, that's for sure. I'm sure that even Sasha would agree that there's room for collaboration and potential as you all build out this new wave of technological innovation. Now, I want to talk to you, get down and dirty with the crypto dirt itself. There's a lot of problems with crypto. Let's be real.
Sure.
And some would argue there's a bit of a crypto cancer that pervades and taints the industry. What's your take on those statements? Do you think that there's some problems inherent with what we see right now?
Oh, wow.
Let me help you out with a few things. Things like collusion, whether that be a dodgy VC or a dodgy exchange or dodgy influencers or the whole melee and collaboration between them. Are there some problems with crypto? Are people, is the wool being pulled over some of our eyes? Or in this ideology of a clean space? Or is it just like every other industry, like Wall Street? We know there's a lot of collusion and bullshit happens, in different contexts there. Is this just another example of when money's involved, there's corruption?
Definitely that. As crypto becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, you'll see increasing corporate interest and, that kind of stuff. Sorry. So there's always going to be shady spots in sectors, right? Crypto, it's a little bit odd because also in many of the cases, some of the kind of the larger powerful players or the medium-sized players, there's also a big element of that they always have to fend for themselves. There's no regulator that you can knock on the door of, right, for some protection or some this or some that. You really need to keep your own house in order. Well, it's a big responsibility. If you're a large crypto exchange or you name it, then there's no insurance or no custody, and nobody wants to bank you, and all the regulators dislike you. Yet you're running a huge enterprise. Then there's always going to be aspects of, all right, then we need to do it ourselves, and that's hard work, and that needs some brutal decision making, and it's you versus the rest, right? There's no umbrella of protection mechanisms. So there's always part of that, and that will always get some hate from various sides, but it's a huge responsibility. But there's also just probably some outright corruption or collusion in
Right. Well, the reason I ask is even if we talk about the influencers side and the content creators, even at that point, I did want to really broach this because I had a look through. You have done some sponsored work with some influencers in the past. I won't name names, but does it ever concern you about the transparency or about the agenda? Because now in this year, 2019, we're seeing a lot of these proponents, previously of altcoins now suggesting let's just all move back into the maximalist agenda of back into BC because the bear market's hit. Now, if that's the case, what are your thoughts on these kinds of proponents of a one-stop shop for BTC when in fact they've been talking about people like you and projects like yours?
Yeah, no, I think you really need to like the discussion we're having now, and there's a few other people kind of from your space that I have that I respect. We can really go in depth and talk about projects and use cases and you name it, and it's good fun. And there's also people that have a much more of a kind of wide advertisement angle, almost, if you will. I'm not saying that there's no room in the space for them, but I think you need to see them as what they are.
Right. So marketers essentially.
Appropriately, yeah. So if you use outlets like that, you should almost compare it to, I don't know, deploying an ad banner on a website somewhere. So you need to have a really crisp call to action, if you will, and not go there to discuss the sector or something like that.
Got it. Okay.
People to, hey guys, we're looking for testnet users, right? And then it's also fine if you say, we're here. Sure, it's sponsored. It's effectively an advertisement, but there's a very clear reason why we're here, and this is that. And it's not to convince you that we are, the next BTC or whatnot. But no, we would just ask you to have a look at this or consider doing this. Right? That's what ads are for. And then on channels like we can have the real conversation. Yeah.
Makes sense. Now, I wanted to ask you, this is a tough question, but do you think that there's ever a point in time when perhaps these content creators realize they have the upper hand and that they can actually start to really capitalize on that and really demand things beyond what would be typical in a traditional setting, where they really start to essentially over monetize? I'm being really direct here because it does seem to be happening a bit.
Yeah, no, definitely. We've also seen it happen. We've probably in the past once or twice also overpaid a little bit because you live and you learn, and sometimes you test an idea and you find it to be not worth the money effectively.
Right.
But I definitely think there's some over monetization going. I also think this is why you see diminished trust in some of these outlets.
I think that's really transparent. I mean, obviously, Jelle, I really appreciate you just speaking on that, on behalf of all of the different co-founders and founders of projects, because rarely we get this insight. Now, partners, if we can talk about that for a moment, you've got a substantial number, and many of them you want to do things with, not just simply partners superficially. Can you give some indicators of what these partners are going to do with, as you build these commercial applications, for example?
Yeah, so one of our of the legal studios that we do an insane amount of work with is Watson Law, for example, and they're also really, they're really helping us, obviously, with our own developments and all of the things that we're building as well. But they're also really zoning in on, easy to replicate legal frameworks for STOs, for example. So really paving the way end to end from, hey, I have a proposition. And oh, hey, here we have a tech platform, but how do we traverse this this legal piece in the middle, right? And a lot of, especially SMEs, will probably have quite similar proposition types, because it's not like, we want to do a 5 billion preference share with this call option, liquid, blah blah blah, right? These huge corporate tranches. It'll probably just be like, I want to do 20% of my equity, no voting rights, something like that, right? Much more clean cut. Right. So they're really building these frameworks with us to really help drive that adoption at a price point that's super relevant for these SMEs. So that's cool. A really big one.
And is that the only one you're going to tell us, or are there others? Is there other examples?
I don't know. So with Switch.io, we do some work that is mainly technical. So there's a lot of thought sharing, that kind of stuff. And then,
I'm thinking bigger than Switch.io. I'm thinking there's others you're not telling me.
Yeah. So, well, we're on they're on the website. We've done a lot of work with Bitfinex and Etfinex in the past.
Yes, you have.
There's ongoing collaborations there. There's a lot of cross marketing. Also some more commercially angled stuff being worked on.
Got it. I'll have to call you again in a few months and find out more. Now, I wanted to talk to you about a term called valuta franca. This is part of your Dusk economy. What does that mean, to coin that term in the context of your whole ecosystem?
It's more of a conceptualization, right? It just abstractly means that that if you're building a certain ecosystem, right, that's so privacy oriented, then probably the fuel should also be privacy oriented, and we're really building it holistically, and not saying that, oh right, we build a great privacy ecosystem, but it still runs on the dollar or something like that, right? All your ducks need to be in one row, and it's also from a dApp point of view. Well, if dApp has a great reason for its own token, then sure, by all means. But I think what we saw also in the ERC ecosystem, that a lot of these tokens were there because funds needed to be raised, but not because there was any added value to having a new token in that dApp. So that's also why we're really big proponents of, if there's no reason for a token, or if if the standard doesn't call for it, then just use Dusk also in the dApp ecosystem, right?
Right.
Because that way we build a much stronger holistic ecosystem, and we don't lose features that we've spent a lot of time on the protocol level, on the dApp level, because you wanted to stick something on top because you needed funds. I'd much rather start building towards an ecosystem where we can help with startup funding, or through things like security tokens, right, equity rounds, and keep the actual utility of the space pure.
Right. Well, let's talk about that in the context of incubation, because from my understanding, that's one of the things you are thinking about doing. And you've also alluded to the value, and you've discussed this, of the core value of the utility token, that is the Dusk token. Surely, because many of the dApps are not going to be tokenized, that's going to really add value to your utility and your platform and your protocol, because you're really espousing a different way of thinking by having untokenized dApps that could essentially run through your protocol.
Yeah, so the token, if there's a need, would ideally be Dusk, because we're adding so much functionality rather than just gas, but also things like privacy features, or you name it, right? Then please use it. And also from a network point of view, what we saw with Ethereum, right? So much of these tokens, they brought a whole suite of issues down the line, right? Or they're not really great self-sustaining economies, or there's a lot of interoperability issues, you name it, where it makes a lot more sense to really build on top of the protocol that you're using
and run through your token.
Yeah, and if you are then in need of capital, then go the for example, the security token route, where it's a lot more sensible to.
And that could be very valuable for you long term as well, if your fuel is your token for that kind of approach, as through incubation, I'd imagine.
Yeah, so it would be great if at some point it reaches a level where everything is fully decentralized and the network as a self-funding mechanism, for example, where it can vote for incubation of certain relevant dApps, right? So that they don't need to resort to their own token that is just there because they need to fundraise. But for example, the DAO or whatever you want to call it, right? Could effectively grant them incubation, but without diluting the ecosystem.
It makes a lot of sense. Now, when it comes to key protocols to really build out your whole architecture, you built in things like the XSC, the standard. You also had the blind protocol, and you have other zero knowledge proof based processes. One of them is called Zero Cap, I think, as well. Do you want to just reference them for a moment? The complexities and the value of all the protocols you've built in.
Yeah, so indeed. So we have the blind bid protocol that we've devised ourselves, and also on a protocol level, you can see very distinct functionalities, right? So blind bid alludes to the fact that we are also embedding privacy on the consensus level, where we use stuff like bullet proofs, making use of libraries that we develop like ZeroCaf, and there's all these privacy modules, if we will, that we developed in order for Dusk to be innovative and viable. Same with our own virtual machine, and these can be very different across protocols. Some of them will say that they use bulletproofs, but then it's typically a range-proof implementation, which is kind of the basic version. But we also use it in the consensus or to hide certain outcomes of consensus processes, if you will.
Right. So all that group of protocols essentially reinforces the privacy. One of the things I did want to ask you as well, Jelle, is has any of this been peer reviewed, or has it been supported by academic institutions that are even beyond the scope of Dusk and the network you have, so that we can trust the autonomy and the objectivity of the peer review?
Yeah, so we're probably publishing some of those as well. But the short answer is yes. So we work with a few applied engineering and research institutes. Basically, they were very, very active in the early days, in kind of the white paper mathematics phase, if you will. Now we work with a lot of other cryptography projects or companies that are relevant to us, right? For example, our lead cryptographer also holds a teaching position at University of Luxembourg, which is one of the zero knowledge leaders, if you will. They founded ZK-Lux, big zero knowledge conference. So there's a lot of universities in our network, research institutes. There's a lot of informal peer review, if you will, going on at all times. And at certain milestones, there's more formal audits, more formal reviews.
So obviously, if people want to know more about the protocols, they cannot go and inquire about through public publications or publications that are coming. So that's exciting. Now, one term that came up a lot in the research, Jelle, was bidirectional. And when we've talked before on the phone, when we were preparing interviews and discussing things, that came up quite a lot when we did talk about it. What does it mean, and why is it important for your system?
Yeah, so there's roughly three types of transactions, right? One is unidirectional, which basically means that I send something to you, so we send it from A to B. The second one is bidirectional, which basically means that we transact something at exactly the same time. So you send something, but I also send you something, but it's one transaction. That's the key differentiator. So it's not like A to B, B to A, which is just two unidirectional transactions, right? But it's bidirectional. So it's one transfer, but there's two things are moving. And the last one is basically time unbound, which a good example, for example, is streaming. So it can be unidirectional or bidirectional, but we don't know when the transaction ends. So watching Netflix, for example, whereas sending you a coin, we know when it ends, right? You have the coin.
So it's finite, yep. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. It's more finite. And the cool thing about bidirectional transactions is that it eliminates the need for a lot of the typical middlemen or things like escrows, because an escrow basically means that instead of A to B, B to A, we both send to C, and then C sends it out when both have been received. But with bidirectional, it kind of eliminates that need. So it means that you can really have like a decentralized asset market, if you will, where people can trust trading with each other peer-to-peer. So it's very much a feature that's very relevant for peer-to-peer functionality. So whether that's peer-to-peer verification or asset transfer, you name it. But it eliminates things like
right. So it's obviously a core part of just really any decentralized mechanism. But custody is another thing. We since you were talking about escrow, another issue is custody concerns, particularly given that you are a protocol level and you're not seeing the other emergent solutions built on a layer 2. How are you going to deal with that, and how are you going to make sure that there's proper insurance entities out there that can also support your venture?
And then you mean custody of the security tokens that will be built on top? Or?
Exactly. Yeah, because obviously without that, I would imagine this whole system wouldn't have trust.
Well, you would place your trust in the issuer if they don't use a custody solution. So if, for example, I'm an SME and I emit a small part of my equity, then it might make sense for this equity to be with the issuer or be with a kind of SME type custody solution of their choice, right? That makes sense for their scale, and all the way up to more institutional players, where it's a lot more relevant to have some serious custody and insurance, right? Because something could go wrong, or you name it, all the typical reasons why you want custody.
Yep. So is that coming for you, Jelle? Is the custody, support coming for what you're trying to build in? Even though you're a protocol, you need to make sure obviously that the consumers have trust and support and the backing of some sort of custody solution.
Yeah, we're working our butts off to have it done and out in the public by September, but it'll definitely be done and out in the public pre-mainnet. So we're working on a solution across the board. The trickier one, slightly on being institutional level, but it's almost there.
Well, that's good. Institutional is a good indicator as well of the kind of parties that are listening in on and taking stock of what you're doing. Now, roadmap already September suggests that you're moving towards a Q4 mainnet plan and unfurling really what you can do from that true native operation. So what's the vision for the rest of the year? To your knowledge, what can you tell us some milestones you really want to make sure occur?
Yeah, so tech-wise, it's testing phase on the testnet and then the mainnet deployment. It's quite straightforward. From a crypto point of view, we're going to be working on some more kind of picks and shovels type uptake. So moving towards things like the ledger supports and the this and the that, and really preparing, some nice to haves for the crypto crowd. Move towards mainnet. And then from the business point of view, that's arguably a very exciting upcoming 6 months, because
do tell.
We're out tech stealth now, and now business stealth is next. So it means announcing and hosting the first STOs. There's a few institutional partners. I'll give some clarity on the secondary market play that we alluded to earlier. Infrastructure partners, things like banking and custody.
It sounds like some seriously big names in this whole space of these discussions you're raising right now about, or these points. It sounds like some of these deals are even right now being discussed or in NDA.
Yeah.
So you're not telling us anything more. Okay, so we can expect some exciting business moves on the chessboard.
Yeah, no, it'll be good fun, and I always wish I could share soon.
I wish you could too. So on that note, let's talk about marketing and PR. It sounds like there's a little bit less focus now on the marketing and PR as you move more to evidence of and empirical proof through these things you're saying, with these announcements you'll be making about real partnerships. So in the future, what's the kind of tact you're going to take with marketing?
Yeah, so it's still we ramped it up significantly. Let's say the last month, and it'll definitely stay on a relatively high pitch for a while yet. We have a lot of content backlogged effectively from our first 6 months of the year, and we were almost in stealth mode. So there's so much coming out around technology, documentation, new white papers. There's a few more advisors that are very interesting that we haven't announced yet.
Yes.
Media coverage, big articles. We're doing a conference, so it's definitely not slowing down by that much. The next 6 months will still be a lot of marketing, and then we'll probably gradually see the proof in the pudding, right?
Absolutely. Well, if you'd like to know more, for those who listeners, you have survived this interview. It's been a very, very long one. So congratulations for that. And Jelle Pol, thank you very much. You are the business lead for what is a very exciting startup known as the Dusk Network, really genuinely trying to change the narrative when it comes to introducing issuance for security systems, for security tokenized models that are all about trying to be share-based, essentially. You're going to change the game, I would imagine, given that you have the technical basis, you have the team to do it. You've been supported by some big names now. Binance is the latest on the July 22nd that happened. More's to come. You're telling me a little bit of a hint of some institutional plays coming, but I wish you all the very best, mate. It's been a real privilege to be able to speak with you. And obviously it would be great if we could catch up in the future to find out more as you build this out.
Yeah, no, privilege is entirely mine, and I would love to be back.
Absolutely. Well, thank you much for you survived the interview, and we'll catch up soon.